In 480 BC, Athens was burning. The most powerful empire on Earth believed it was only one step away from final victory. Athens had been destroyed. Greek resistance seemed broken. And before the narrow strait of Salamis, Xerxes looked out over the sea as if he were already watching his own triumph. But that small stretch of water was hiding something no amount of force could guarantee: strategy. The city had fallen, but the war had not. And within a few hours, Salamis would stop being just a place and become the stage for one of the most humiliating defeats in Persian history. If you enjoy diving into great battles, the strategies that changed empires, and the most remarkable stories of the ancient world, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below where you're watching from. I'd really love to know what part of the world you're joining this journey through history from. Before Salamis became the setting for a memorable reversal, it was necessary to recognize the true scale of the enemy standing before the Greeks. On the other side was Xerxes I, the great king of Persia, heir to Darius and ruler of an empire whose size seemed to go beyond the imagination of the Greek world. His authority stretched from Asia Minor to the deepest regions of the East. Supported by an efficient administrative machine, vast tax resources, and a military power that had already subdued countless peoples. In Herodotus, Xerxes does not appear simply as a campaign commander. He appears as the living expression of a massive imperial power, a ruler whose very presence projected the idea of inevitability. When the invasion of Greece began, Xerxes was not marching toward some uncertain gamble. He advanced with the confidence of a man who represented the greatest political and military force of his time. The crossing of the Hellespont, carried out by means of bridges thrown across the strait, was already in itself an almost theatrical demonstration of power. It was not only about moving troops from one continent to another. It was about showing the world that even geography itself could be forced to bow before the will of the great king. That image helps build the antagonist from the very beginning. Xerxes was not a cautious ruler, but a monarch used to seeing his plans carried out on a monumental scale. The earlier victories of the Persian campaign made that image even heavier. On land, the Persians had broken the resistance at Thermopylae, where the death of Leonidas and his men, though turned into heroic memory, did not stop the invaders' advance. At sea, the clashes at Artemisium did not give the Greeks the decisive advantage they needed, and soon after came the blow with the greatest symbolic impact. Athens was evacuated and burned. The Persians were no longer standing at the borders of the Greek world. They had already pushed into the heart of Hellas. Its temples, its homes, its sacred spaces had been reached by fire. Each of these victories enlarged the image of Xerxes. He was not the king of some distant threat. He was the ruler of a force that had already won on land, pressed hard at sea, and reduced Athens to smoking ruins. The sheer size of the Persian expedition made everything even more threatening. The ancient numbers vary, but Xerxes' fleet at Salamis probably still numbered somewhere between 600 and 800 warships, while the Greek coalition had around 370 to 380 triremes. The difference was enough to make the Greek disadvantage obvious. Even after earlier losses, the Persians could still bring a far larger naval force into the strait. There was no balance between the two sides. There was a greater, richer, and more numerous imperial power advancing against a smaller alliance that was under pressure and divided. That superiority, moreover, did not come from one single people. Xerxes' fleet was the perfect image of a multinational empire. Under his command sailed Phoenician, Egyptian, Cypriot, Ionian, Carian, and other contingents from peoples brought under Achaemenid rule. This gave the antagonist an even more impressive dimension. It was not only Persia on the move. It was a vast imperial coalition, gathering different regions, maritime traditions, and human resources under the command of one ruler. What was approaching Salamis was not merely an armada. It was the military form of an empire that had learned how to absorb entire nations into its machinery of war. Among these names, one stands out in a special way in the ancient traditions: Artemisia of Caria. Herodotus gives her unusual attention, and that is revealing. Her presence enriches the construction of the Persian side, because it shows that this force was not defined only by brute numbers. There was naval experience, political leadership, and tactical judgment among Xerxes' allies. Artemisia, as both queen and commander, gives a face and a certain sophistication to the empire. She reminds us that the Greek enemy was not only powerful, but also capable of gathering remarkable figures under its banner. At the center of everything remained Xerxes, and perhaps the most important trait in his construction as the antagonist is the confidence with which he led the campaign. He did not move like a man who still needed to earn legitimacy. He acted like someone who already believed he was close to the final outcome. The tradition that places him watching the battle from a high position is powerful for exactly that reason. It turns the Persian king into an almost theatrical figure, distant, sovereign, grand, seated above the fighting as if he were waiting only for the public confirmation of his victory. That image captures what Salamis needed to defeat. Not only a larger fleet, not only a victorious army, but the imperial conviction that Greece was already doomed. That is what makes Xerxes such a strong figure. He carries with him the prestige of earlier victories, the mass of a superior navy, the diversity of an entire empire, and the quiet arrogance of someone who believes the world already belongs to his will. Salamis, before becoming proof of Greek cunning, was the moment when that giant seemed larger than ever. If Xerxes represented the massive weight of an empire moving forward as if victory were inevitable, the Greek side carried a very different kind of drama. At Salamis, there was no expanding power trying to stretch its borders. There was a fragile, pressured alliance, smaller in number, fighting to prevent the disappearance of its own world. And within that alliance, the focus falls most strongly on the Athenians and on Themistocles, because Athens was the one that suffered the most visible blow, and Themistocles was the one who realized there was still a way out when many others could see only ruin. Athens did not arrive at Salamis as an untouched city, confident in its strength. It arrived as a wounded city. Its population had been evacuated in haste, its homes had been left behind, and its temples were now at the mercy of the invader. There was something deeply humiliating in that condition. The Athenians were not marching out to defend distant borders or expand their political prestige. They were looking back and seeing their own city abandoned to the flames. That detail completely changes the emotional weight of the story. The Greeks were not fighting for conquest. They were fighting so they would not lose their memory, their gods, their dead, and the independence of their cities. That sense of urgency, however, did not immediately create unity. Herodotus clearly preserves the tension among the Greeks, and that is exactly what makes this moment so human and so dramatic. The Hellenic coalition was not a perfectly coordinated machine. It was an alliance made up of cities with different interests, different fears, and different priorities. Many did not want to remain at Salamis. There were leaders who argued for a withdrawal to the Isthmus of Corinth, where they believed it would be safer to concentrate the defense of the Peloponnese. The logic seemed understandable. If the mainland could be fortified, why risk everything in one decisive naval battle? This disagreement is central because it shows that the Greeks were not only at a disadvantage against the Persians. They were also facing their own internal divisions. The danger came from outside, but the hesitation came from within. That makes the situation even more delicate. A larger and stronger enemy would already have been enough. But at Salamis, the Greeks also had to overcome fear, doubt, and regional interests that threatened to break their resistance into pieces. The Greek side then was not only smaller, it was also unstable. This is the point where Themistocles becomes decisive. Among the Greeks, few understood as clearly as he did that the war would not be saved at the isthmus, but at sea. Themistocles had already shown his strategic vision earlier when he pushed for the strengthening of Athens' navy, and now that vision became the coalition's last real hope. Instead of thinking only as a politician or magistrate, he thought like someone capable of reading the course of the entire war. If the Persians kept naval superiority, they could move around defensive positions on land, supply their troops, isolate regions, and crush resistance little by little. They had to be confronted in the one setting where their size could be reduced by a smart choice of battlefield. Plutarch, even writing centuries later, preserves this image of Themistocles as a man of great political cunning, strong presence, and rare ability to lead difficult allies. That matters because, at Salamis, he did not only need to imagine a strategy, he needed to convince other Greeks to accept it. And that may have been one of his greatest victories even before the first clash of oars and bronze. The battle required the allies to stay there despite fear and pressure. It required firmness at a moment when retreat seemed wiser to many. Themistocles, then, was not only the architect of a military maneuver. He was also the man who prevented the political collapse of Greek resistance at its most fragile moment. The Greek fleet gathered at Salamis reflected this delicate balance between fragility and determination. The most repeated ancient traditions speak of around 370 ships, with some counts reaching 378 triremes. It was a respectable force, but clearly smaller than the Persian naval mass. Even so, those numbers take on another meaning when we consider what stood behind them. Each Greek ship did not represent only military capacity. It represented the decision to stay, to resist, and to put the rest of Greek freedom on the line in that narrow strait. The Persians were fighting to expand an empire that was already vast. The Greeks were fighting to prevent the end of their homes, their cities, and their way of life. On one side was conquest. On the other was survival. On one side was Xerxes' imperial ambition. On the other was a divided alliance, smaller in number, but driven by the need to keep existing. That is what makes Salamis so powerful. Greek strength did not come from material superiority. It came from the awareness that if they retreated once more, there might be nothing left to defend. And it was at that extreme point, between ruin, fear, and calculation, that Themistocles turned a cornered people into a resistance. The Persian force was larger. Its fleet was bigger. Its empire was richer. And its king was advancing with the confidence of someone who had already burned Athens and broken resistance on land and at sea. If the battle had been fought in open waters, everything favored Xerxes. In a wide space, the mass of his ships could spread out more effectively, surround the Greeks, put pressure on several points at once, and use numerical superiority as a true operational advantage. That is exactly why Salamis became a battle of intelligence before it became a battle of collision. Themistocles understood that the Greeks could not win by trying to match Persian strength in the open. They had to force the enemy to fight where its very size would become a problem. The Strait of Salamis offered exactly that. There, between the island and the coast of Attica, the sea stopped being a wide surface for maneuvering and became a narrow corridor, with limited movement, compressed formations, and almost no room for quick corrections. In that kind of space, the larger fleet could no longer fully use its advantage. Too many ships stopped being only a source of added strength and began competing with one another for space, rhythm, and alignment. The more vessels gathered there, the greater the risk of confusion. Numerical superiority, which in open waters could have been decisive, began to lose part of its value in that narrow and uneven setting. This was the core of Themistocles' tactical reading. The battle would not be decided only by the bravery of the rowers or the steadiness of the hoplites on board. It would be decided by the choice of location, by control of timing, and by the ability to make the enemy act under pressure in the wrong conditions. That is what makes Salamis one of the most powerful stories in ancient warfare. Geography stopped being a backdrop and became a weapon. The strait was not just the setting of the confrontation. It was the silent instrument that could reduce the weight of the Persian Empire and give the Greeks a real chance to resist. But for that to work, it was not enough to wait for Xerxes to make a mistake on his own. He had to be pushed into that mistake. And this is where the most famous episode in the entire lead-up to the battle appears: the trick of Themistocles. Herodotus reports that he sent a message to the Persian king through a trusted man, essentially saying that the Greeks were divided, demoralized, and on the verge of fleeing. The message was carefully designed. If Xerxes believed it, he would likely act quickly to block the exit, prevent the enemy's retreat, and turn what he thought was a certain victory into an immediate conclusion. Instead of waiting, reorganizing, or choosing another way to fight, the Persian king would be pushed into attacking at the very time and in the very place that favored the Greeks. The brilliance of this move lies in its simplicity. Themistocles did not try to convince Xerxes of something absurd. He took advantage of what already seemed believable. The Greeks really were divided in their debates. There really were leaders arguing for retreat. The idea of flight did not sound impossible. The trick worked because it was built on a real situation and pushed it in the direction he wanted. That is an important detail because it shows the quality of Themistocles' psychological reading. He did not only manipulate the battlefield, he manipulated the enemy's perception. He made Xerxes see the situation in exactly the way that would lead him to the wrong decision. Plutarch, writing much later, reinforces this image of Themistocles as a man of extraordinary cunning, capable of understanding people just as well as he understood war. At Salamis, his political and psychological skill was just as important as his military calculation. He needed to contain discouragement among the allies, keep the Greek fleet united, and at the same time lead the Persian king to believe that he was acting in his own interest by rushing into battle. Few ancient commanders combined these three qualities so clearly at once: strategic vision, political firmness, and the ability to deceive the enemy. Once Xerxes agreed to fight in the strait, the turning point had already been set in motion. His fleet would be entering an area where movement was limited, formations would be compressed, and coordination would become much harder. A force that large depended on space to spread out its wings, adjust its rhythm, and use its superiority. In the strait, all of that became much more difficult. The Persian ships ran the risk of getting in each other's way, losing cohesion, and turning their own mass into a source of disorder. At the same time, the Greeks, with around 370 to 380 triremes, could hold a tighter line and operate with greater clarity inside that restricted space. What had seemed like an impossible disadvantage was finally beginning to take on a different shape. That is why Salamis cannot be understood only as a victory of courage. It was a victory of calculation. Themistocles realized that the path forward was not to resist Persian strength head-on, but to force that strength to fold in on itself. Xerxes fell into the trap because he believed he was speeding up his victory, when in reality, he was giving up the best way to use his own superiority. In the end, that was the tactical turning point of the battle. The greater force was led into wasting what it had that was most valuable. And the moment that happened, the balance of the war began to change. When the battle truly began, the Persian mistake was already in motion. The greatness of that fleet, which in open water would have been an almost irresistible instrument of pressure, now carried the weight of its own disorder in the narrow strait. There were too many ships for too little space. The lines tightened, orders became harder to pass along, the rhythm of the formation began to break, and freedom of movement shrank with every moment. What was supposed to be a display of superiority slowly began to turn into confusion. Herodotus and later Diodorus preserve exactly this image. an enormous force losing effectiveness as it pressed itself into a battlefield that did not favor it. The problem was not only the absolute number of ships, but the impossibility of making them operate clearly in such a limited space. Vessels that were supposed to move forward in coordination began competing for position, falling out of alignment and interfering with one another's movements. The mass of the fleet, which in theory guaranteed advantage, began to produce noise, delay, and vulnerability. On the Greek side, the picture was different. Their numerical disadvantage still existed, but it no longer defined everything. With a tighter line and a clearer understanding of the space in which they were fighting, the Greeks could respond with greater cohesion. Their triremes did not need to win through numbers. They needed to win through steadiness, discipline, and the correct use of the strait. It was at that moment that the battle stopped being only the preparation of a trap and became its closing act. Persian pressure, instead of crushing the Greeks all at once, began to lose shape inside the very tightness of the battlefield. Ships got in one another's way, movements crossed badly, and the force that was supposed to surround the enemy began to struggle even to organize itself. This is the true climax of Salamis. Not just the collision of ships, the crash of bronze-covered prows, and the brutal effort of the rowers, but the moment when it became clear that the most powerful empire in the world was fighting under the wrong conditions. The battle then took on a meaning greater than the simple sum of blows exchanged on the water. It came to represent the collapse of a certainty. Xerxes had arrived in Greece as the master of a massive military machine. At Salamis, he saw that machine begin to fail at the exact point where he expected its greatest triumph. That is why the Persian defeat was not only material, it was moral. In Aeschylus, who wrote the Persians only a few years after the battle, the memory of Salamis appears covered in grief, ruin, and humiliation. The event is treated not just as a military setback, but as a catastrophe for an empire that believed it was advancing irresistibly. This gives the end of the battle a powerful, tragic weight. The disaster was not only in the ships lost or the men killed. It was in the breaking of prestige. The wound opened in imperial pride, and the realization that the Persian advance was not invincible. The exact numbers of the losses vary in the ancient traditions, but the scale of the blow seems clear. Many modern reconstructions, based on ancient sources, work with the possibility that the Persians lost around 200 to 300 ships, whether destroyed, sunk, or captured, while the Greeks may have lost somewhere around 30 to 50 vessels. These numbers are not absolute, but they help show the scale of the defeat. More important than the final number is the effect of the outcome. At Salamis, the Persian fleet stopped representing secure control over that theater of war. And without security at sea, the invasion could no longer move forward with the same confidence. The immediate consequence was enormous. After Salamis, Xerxes' campaign lost momentum. The possibility of deciding the war through naval domination, isolating the Greeks, and sustaining the Persian advance suffered a deep blow. The Greek victory did not end the war that day, but it changed its direction. The empire was still powerful, still had troops, and could still continue the struggle. But it no longer advanced with the same aura of inevitability. The strait had imposed a limit. Greek strategy, naval discipline, and the choice of terrain had accomplished what seemed unlikely. They had checked the movement of the greatest empire in the world. This turning point helps explain why Salamis became one of the great moments of change in the Greco-Persian Wars. Before it, the Persian advance seemed like an almost unbroken sequence of pressure, rupture, and conquest. After it, the story changes. The momentum breaks. What had seemed to be Xerxes' inevitable march meets enough resistance to alter the course of the war. In the following year, the Greeks would still need to secure that reversal in battles like Plataea and Mycale, but Salamis had already fulfilled a decisive role. It showed that the empire could be stopped, that its power was not absolute, and that its superiority could be neutralized when it faced intelligence, discipline, and unfavorable ground. Maybe that is why Salamis remains so powerful in historical memory. It is remembered not only as a Greek victory. It is remembered as proof that brute force alone is not enough when it is drawn into the wrong place. The narrow waters of Salamis forced the Persian Empire to fight in a way that worked against it. And by doing that, Themistocles and the Greeks turned inferiority into a possible advantage, resistance into victory, and imperial confidence into tragedy. In the end, it was not the size of the fleet that decided the fate of that day. It was the intelligence of making an empire waste its own greatness. If you enjoyed this video and want to keep discovering the battles, strategies, and figures that changed the course of history, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your support is essential for us to keep bringing you content like this. And write down here in the comments, what other battle, historical figure, or major event would you like to see here next? I want to know what the next story will be that we explore together.